Good morning, everyone. I'm Judy Maggio with Austin PBS. Welcome to Engage. We appreciate everyone watching on Facebook this morning. A big thank you to our Engage presenting sponsor, Dell Children's. We really appreciate that thoughtful message from Geronimo Rodriguez, who is the Chief Advocacy Officer for Ascension, Texas. Now, our topic is the second one on the election 2020. We're going to be looking at civic engagement during a pandemic. I am so honored to be co-moderating these discussions with Courtney Bailey. She is the program director for the Engage series for Leadership Austin. I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to give us some framework for today's topic. Courtney?
Thank you, Judy. So today we will be discussing the importance of sustaining civic engagement in our region. And civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. And contrary to popular belief, civic engagement can be political, non-political, paid, and even unpaid. And according to research, cities with strong civic health tend to have informed, empowered, and civically engaged community members. And so our hope is that our speakers will be able to provide recommendations on how we can maintain a high level of civic leadership that goes beyond the elections and becomes a vital part of our day-to-day actions. So I'm really excited to see what they have to say. Judy?
We're certainly excited to hear what they have to say too, because civic engagement really is at the heart of our democracy. Joining us today are panelists who I know will help us get a better understanding of the vast importance of civic engagement. I want to introduce you to them right now. We first have Rafa Behar. He is Director of Outreach for Texas Public Policy Foundation. We have Patrick Bixler. He's an assistant professor at the University of Texas LBJ School of Public Affairs. And we have Sarita Fontanesi. She is the first ever Black constituency organizer at the Texas Democratic Party. Thank you all so much for giving us your time and expertise this morning.
Thank you.
We're going to start with a question about your role and the work you do and how it relates to civic engagement. And more importantly, from your perspective, how you think COVID-19 has changed the way people come together in a community. Rafa, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Judy. I can say that throughout my 30-year career in political and civic engagement, I've had the opportunity to work in 38 states across this great country, throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And although we're living in challenging times, the one thing that I learned early on and remains true to this very day is that, wherever I go and whoever I speak with, people are people. And before I talk, it's always important to listen. And although we may not always agree on issues, it's important to show respect. So for the Texas Public Policy Foundation is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit think tank where we promote and defend liberty, personal responsibility, and free enterprise. And for us, civic engagement is an everyday proposition. We deal with a whole host of issues, from education to healthcare to government accountability and transparency, criminal justice reform, foster care reform. So we deal with a lot of different issues, and it's very important to reach out to people across Texas on how they feel about these issues and get them to engage with us, and also make that bridge, have them engage directly with the Texas legislature. In the course of the pandemic, obviously we've had to shift to a more digital format to communicate with people. We communicate with thousands of people on a weekly basis. And it's been challenging. My particular specialty is the face-to-face communication, interpersonal and communication. Has been my strong suit, and that there's a certain magic that happens in these face-to-face meetings that really can't be replicated through a digital format. Yes, having Zoom calls is great for reaching, large folks, but still, it's very important to have that, person-to-person contact, right? Because that's what civic engagement is all about.
Patrick, I know that civic engagement is really at the core of what you teach at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Talk about that, and also talk about how the pandemic has impacted the way we gather and become civically engaged as communities.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thanks everyone so much for putting this together today. And I'm just honored to be included in this discussion. So at the LBJ School, I teach classes on community engagement and volunteerism and collaborative governance. And one of my primary projects that I run is the Austin Area Sustainability Indicators. We track quality of life and sustainability across the 6-county region. And one of our key focus areas is civic engagement. We've developed a scorecard and a set of indicators. And in 2018, we released this report that looked at a civic health index across the Austin area. Part of what we really emphasize when we think about civic health is thinking about a 3-legged stool. So it's not just political participation, which is obviously incredibly important and a really hot topic this time of year, but also civic involvement in the way that we think about giving time and money, and social connectedness. So things such as neighborliness and actively participating in public forums, neighborhood meetings, nonprofit organizations. And as you can imagine, me and my team have had a lot on our minds in terms of thinking about the impact of the pandemic on quality of life in the Austin area and also civic engagement. Part of what I wanted to do today is provide kind of an update on our scorecard, on our data. Our research and our sort of programming have been impacted by COVID, just like everything else. So we're a little bit behind schedule. But what is cool is I can provide some preliminary data. This may change as we move forward. We only have partially collected samples so far. But it's really interesting what we're seeing kind of in these preliminary indicators, in that for most measures of civic engagement or civic health that we measure, things seem to be either the same or actually improving. So folks who reported voting in the last local election has gone up quite a bit. Greater participation in political campaigns has gone up quite a bit. Increased awareness in key issues, and reports of neighborhood cohesion. So I find that, again, preliminary and that could change, but I find that extremely encouraging, and a really strong signal that civic health and civic engagement in the Austin area is really strong, despite the barriers that have been presented to us given COVID. Perhaps not surprisingly, one place where we see pretty significant declines are in participation in government meetings and participation in nonprofit meetings. Again, a word of caution that's sort of preliminary, but based on the data we have back so far, for the most part, you see these pretty strong indicators of civicness and civic health in the Austin area.
Well, when you look at the long lines of the first day of early voting yesterday, you certainly think that people want to be civically engaged, because it's getting them to stay engaged beyond going to the polls. Thank you, Patrick. And finally, Sarita, you're fairly new to the Austin area in this wonderful new role with the Texas Democratic Party. Talk about civic engagement from your perspective and your work that you've done since you arrived here.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big part of my role with the party is actively engaging community members, both locally and beyond, and making sure that Black voters across the state feel empowered and prepared and ready to vote now that we're in early vote and come November 3rd. So what that really has looked like is, especially once quarantine started, I think folks are feeling particularly motivated this year for a multitude of reasons. The pandemic has really shined a light on a lot of inequities that I think a lot of us who are sort of in the thick of it were aware of, but now everyone's had to really face. And so that's given people an opportunity to say, hey, I really care about this issue or this subject or this topic, and what can I do about it? How can I change that? And I always like to tell people that there are a multitude of lanes on the highway of change. I think sometimes we get stuck in the idea that it has to look a certain way, that if I'm not out protesting in the street, then I'm not doing enough. Or if I'm not going to city council meetings, then I'm not doing my part. And what I want to remind folks is figure out the lane that makes sense for you and then focus on that and do that well. Because all of us can't do everything. All of us aren't going to be good at everything. But if we can really hone in on what is fulfilling to us, what we feel we are doing well, and we want to learn more about, then we can each do our share of the work to continue to move the community forward.
Thank you, Sarita. I like that. Figure out the lane. That's good. So I want to go to you, Patrick. So I've heard specific communities express frustration with some leaders only coming around when they need something from that specific community, like such as a vote. How do we create sustainable channels of civic engagement and partnership year-round in all communities, especially those communities that have been pushed to the margins?
Yeah, I think there are some general principles that we can think about. And first and foremost, it's already been mentioned today, but that civic health is related to all kinds of outcomes that we care about. It's related to better health. It's related to stronger economies. It's related to cleaner environments. And if only we could impress that message to sort of all of our public officials, nonprofit leaders, business leaders, and to again, before elections, after elections, every day, really think about what strengthens communities, what strengthens networks. Our research indicates that there are some specific ingredients that are critical for sustainable channels of civic engagement. And they're pretty basic, such as trust, building relationships, and starting small. I think one of the things that we can do to make partnerships sustainable is find that middle ground, even if it's really small. Find that middle ground on some issue that we can all agree on, and start working from there. If you can sort of have that initial catalyzation and start to build trust, build relationships, it creates those sustainable pathways to stronger civic engagement. And the thing is, we need policies and programs that build that cohesion, sort of those networks. And this is really a thing that we can do. We can intentionally weave networks of residents, nonprofits, public agencies, public officials, in ways that build those relationships, build those trust, and creates this sort of inherent capacity to address collective problems and challenges that we all face.
One of the things we want to recognize during our discussion is this is the second to the last day of Hispanic Heritage Month. And the purpose of Hispanic Heritage Month is to really celebrate the contributions of the Hispanic and Latinx communities. And Hispanics are expected to become the largest population group here in Texas as early as 2022. Rafa, this is the question for you. What are some ways that our local government and our systems can better involve the Hispanic and Latinx communities in different forms of civic engagement?
Well, thank you for the question, Judy. What I would say is that for me, it's hard to imagine a Texas without Hispanics in it. It's virtually impossible. And I think that it's not only for government, but for society, Texas society at large, to really think about, the history, the legacy that's there. I mean, Hispanics have been in Texas for over 300 years. And they don't realize how much part of the history that Hispanics have participated in. And you have going back to even the days of the American Revolution, you had Tejanos do cattle drives to help support American patriots, right? So there you're talking about the American Revolution. People don't understand that during the American Civil War, you had, Tejanos fighting on both sides, both blue and gray. Obviously, during the Texas War of Independence, Tejanos were central to the fight for the creation of Texas. We had 9 Tejanos die at the Alamo. We had Hispanic Tejano leaders, forming, the central key government. And the list goes on and on and on. I mean, we have 15 Congressional Hispanic Medals of Honor winners here in the state of Texas. Hispanics has always been part of Texas. It's part of our DNA. It's in our blood. And I think that that's something that we all need to realize. And then as far as governmental institutions go, is that we need to also realize that, again, people are people, and that we need to talk to people and see what the concerns are and include them in the conversation, and not really treat them necessarily different, but also understand how long we've been in the community.
Thank you, Rafa. So I'm going to go to Sarita next. So as Judy mentioned earlier, you are the first ever Black constituency organizer at the Texas Democratic Party. And some would say it is taking a long time for such a position to be created. So I'd like to hear from you. How do you plan to ensure that your role is more than symbolic? And what suggestions do you have for other organizations creating similar roles?
Yeah, like you said, this role has never existed within the Texas Democratic Party. In fact, the TDP hasn't had an organizing program in over 30 years. And so I think what that really points to is the party recognizing the importance of the community members who hold them up. We know that Black voters are the backbone of the Democratic Party, especially here in Texas. And I think how this role really came about is the organization realized, and I'm one of 6 different constituency organizers. So we have a Latinx organizer, AAPI, people with disabilities, rural LGBTQ, and millennials and Gen Z. So a pretty wide swath of folks who I think the Democratic Party know, these are the people who keep us going. These are the people who continue to show up for us. And that is especially true for Black voters. And so wanting to honor that, wanting to recognize that, I think that's how this role came to be. Knowing that 2020 and flipping the state isn't possible without Black voters being not just showing up and supporting, but enthusiastically supporting, right? And so the way that we make sure that this role isn't just symbolic is to continue the work beyond November 3rd. I talk about building infrastructure within the communities, and what that really means is making sure that community members and community groups have the resources that they need to feel informed about local races, to feel informed about state level, federal. We're always telling people to vote up and down the ballot because those local elections are the ones that really impact your day-to-day life the most. It means making sure that after November 3rd, we're keeping people informed and engaged throughout the legislative session. We're talking about redistricting, right? That's going to start in 2021. We're talking about the governor's race well before September of 2022, and making sure that our community members are actively involved in the conversation also. I think a big part of my work in terms of community engagement has been bringing community members into a conversation that they have historically felt not even left out of, but just overlooked. And so when folks feel like they have a meaningful voice at the table, then that means that the work can continue beyond just one election.
Thank you, Sarita.
Yeah, I'm unmuting myself. The joys of holding a conversation on Zoom. Courtney has the next question, but I do want to remind everyone, if you're watching on Facebook, on the Leadership Austin page, on the Austin PBS page, this panel is called Engage. We want to hear from you guys. If you have questions for our panel members, it's easy. Just leave it in the comment section wherever you're watching, and we have folks monitoring that. And then Courtney and I will ask your questions of the panel as well. Back to you now, Courtney.
Thank you, Judy. So Patrick touched on this earlier, but I want to reiterate that an important aspect of civic engagement is this notion of neighborliness, or having a sense of trust and connection to your neighbors. I'm curious to hear from any of you about how has the pandemic altered the way we relate to people who live around us? And can you just speak to why neighborliness is important to the civic health of our region? And anyone who would like to go?
Sure. So I think that that's extremely important, right? I mean, because at the end of the day, no matter what happens at the election, we still need to live together with one another, and that's crucial. Now, how what's happened with the pandemic is that that's really put sort of like an artificial blocker on those normal relationships that we have, and especially during the early days of the pandemic, and may have been created by some of the hype of the media and stuff that, I mean, I remember that, even within my own family, people were scared of just, looking at other people, right? But we've all gotten past that, and that we realize that we also have to live together, and that it is part of human nature to have these interactions with each other, and that and talk about the issues and what's going on, and then obviously with what's happening with politically with the various protests and riots and that sort of thing. I mean, protest is good, and it's certainly encouraged within the realms of the Constitution, but riots aren't. And people are talk about that. I travel all across the state, from Amarillo to Brownsville to El Paso to Houston, and these are significant topics that people talk about. And people are still obviously mindful that there is a pandemic, and they respect social distancing and all of those type of precautions, but people still want to talk to each other about these issues.
Thank you, Rafa. Sarita, Patrick, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with the idea of neighborliness. I think early in the pandemic, we were all just, the unknown is very scary, right? When we don't know what's going on, when we don't know how to protect ourselves, how to prevent things from happening, that causes fear and alarm. I think now that we are in a lot of ways adjusting to this new normal, right? We're getting used to wearing our masks. We're knowing to limit our trips, being really mindful of when and where and how we move through spaces. I think it's becoming a little more possible to engage with each other. And I actually, Rafa, you reminded me, I think that was really evident in a lot of the protests we've seen. We had folks coming out, everyone wearing a mask, people registering to vote while they were there. So making it not just about the moment at hand, but about how we can engage in the future, because we elect our judges, we elect our sheriffs, we elect folks who have major impact on the justice system. And so, Obama said this in a speech recently of, you can protest and vote, right? It's not a one or the other. And so this idea of neighborliness, folks bringing water and food and milk in case there was pepper spray or mace use, making sure that everyone had supplies to protest safely, to make it as effective as possible without adding to the chaos of the pandemic, without disengaging from some of our civic roles like voting. Again, you don't have to pick one or the other. You can pick both. And so I think that really highlighted what is at the heart and what is being asked of communities, especially Black communities right now, is to recognize that we are all humans who all have needs, and some folks haven't been getting their needs met for a very long time in very serious ways. And so this is how other community members can step up and be a part of the solution, whether it's joining in a protest, whether it's getting signatures on a petition, working for a campaign for a candidate that really speaks to the values that other folks are out in the street fighting for. So it can look, again, that idea of different lanes, it can look in different ways, but ultimately, we've really had a big call to action to come together and support one another. Otherwise, I don't know that we'll really get to the end of this.
Yeah, I will say this, though, that, and I know that I brought up the topic of protest. Protest is one extreme, right? And although it is an activity that is certainly allowed and even encouraged in certain aspects in the Constitution as part of our civic rights, protest is almost a failure of the communication that should have happened beforehand. And I think that that's what we need to focus on. And I think, Courtney, going back to your original question, is the sense of neighborliness and going back and really actually talking to people and figuring out what are the real concerns that they have on the day-to-day, and try to deal with that in a civil manner, right? Instead of yelling and screaming at each other. That's what we really need to get back to.
Patrick, I'm wondering, what do you teach in your class about the importance of this type of activity, and also that whole aspect of neighborliness and knowing your neighbors and getting involved through the very most grassroots efforts you can do, and that is encouraging the people you live around?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's extremely important. And it's interesting to think about the potential opportunities that the pandemic, COVID brings, but also the way it may restructure some of our economic systems and the way we work from home. So I think, there was right in the early stages of the pandemic, the Italian prime minister said, "I've never known that so many people were runners." And at least anecdotally, right, that felt so true in my neighborhood. All of a sudden we saw people out walking the streets, and we sort of were able to engage from a distance with folks we sort of knew, and meet a whole lot of people that we didn't, had never met before. And so I think like they're currently in the pandemic times, but even projected to be in the future, there's expected to be a lot more people working from home, which means a lot more time in your house, in your neighborhood, in your front yard. And so those opportunities to actually enhance community cohesion, enhance neighborliness, may very well increase, which could be a really neat outcome of the pandemic. I think alternatively, right, if we think about the drivers that can reduce neighborhood cohesion, community cohesion, we think about displacement. And I think that's a really important thing for cities like Austin, basically the major metropolitan areas in Texas. There are larger economic forces that are driving residents to have to leave their neighborhoods. And, in some cases, residents have lived there 30, 40 years. And, that is a kind of a systemic or system level driver that fractures community cohesion. And so the ways that we can have those conversations around the importance of neighborliness, the importance of community cohesion, and sort of what are the larger scale or macro scale opportunities, but also challenges that may threaten that.
Thank you, Patrick. So I want to add to that. So this question is from Missy. How do we lift up the counties around Travis County? Sometimes we focus largely on Austin, but our surrounding communities need a lift as well. So what are some things that we can do to make sure that those communities are lifted in this aspect of civic engagement? Anyone who wants to answer? Sarita, I see you.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think this is where we really have to think about things like mutual aid. How can we share resources? How can we redistribute what some folks have and some folks don't? And I think we've started to see that more and more showing up in the pandemic, right? Like community refrigerators, community food drives, helping share the load a little bit. And especially as we think about our areas that are sort of outside of the city center. So we start getting a little more rural, a little more far out. We were talking about this before the call. Rural infrastructure doesn't look the same as city infrastructure. So that means access to internet, access to reliable phone service, access to doctors, right? Like all of these things that, for some of us who live in the city is a 10, 15 minute drive or like a quick call to deal with, isn't necessarily accessible to our folks outside of the city, the main city. And so when we think about mutual aid and we think about sharing those resources, it's really how do we either expand what's in the city to cover folks who are outside, or how do we get folks from outside the city center in a way that is accessible and, it's not causing folks to have to take time off work or have to, figure out childcare, that type of thing. And so I think an important call to action for those of us, especially who are, again, in these city centers that maybe have more, is how can you set up that same phone bank that you're doing inside the city in a rural community? How can you partner with your library in a safe and COVID-friendly way to make sure that students who are on the outskirts of town still have quality internet access so that school is still possible during the pandemic, right? And so it's really challenging each other to think about a we instead of a me, and really think about sharing our collective resources.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take. I mean, I've never been a fan of redistribution, but I will say this, that, you know, a lot of focus does go into, you know, a lot of our urban core areas. Certainly Austin is one of them. And I think that what needs to happen, I do a lot of meetings and talking to folks in areas primarily outside of Austin and around the surrounding areas, is to foster that, what we were talking about before, that sense of neighborliness and that sense of communication within those areas. And that, you know, Pflugerville, for example, is not more important than Austin, right? And then what is important to the people in Pflugerville, or what is important to the people in Round Rock, and to kind of, you know, foster those communications and not really have you know, an answer that necessarily comes from government, but it comes from the people.
Yeah, I think that notion of neighbor, if we think about community cohesion, right, we also need to be thinking about regional cohesion. The data suggests that the Austin area is going to at least double in population in the next 30 years, or less than the next 30 years. And so we will be living closer together, the central downtown core, outerlying communities, in ways that we can think about what's in the best interest of the region, and how we, you know, find that common ground and design policies that make the whole area, the quality of life in the whole area better and more sustainable. I think that will serve us well in the future.
I think we all tend to get very narrow focused dealing with the issues where we live, and we are a region, and it is important to think about that. This morning I posted something about early voting on my Facebook page, and I said, get out there and vote. And somebody said, well, we can't vote until 10 a.m. And I was like, no, you start voting 7 a.m., 7 p.m. And this person goes, I'm in Hays County, we don't vote till 10 a.m. And I was like, yeah, that's right. You know, we forget that there's a large contingent of the population here that doesn't live in the Austin city limits. I want to talk and put politics aside for a moment and talk truly about voting from a civics perspective. Maybe not this election year, but in the past, I think a lot of people who live in places that are considered red strongholds or blue strongholds sometimes feel their votes just don't count. Some of those people may actually opt out of voting. So how do we convince those people that their voice really does matter when they feel like they're outnumbered? Patrick, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, you know, I think, I mean, in part, I think it does include innovating the way we think about and teach civics and civic engagement. That starts with younger generations, so folks better understand the role of the political process and how it works, and how, you know, your voice does matter, and every single vote matters. And then to sort of not answer the question too, emphasize the connections between voting and social connectedness and civic involvement. All of those indicators are highly correlated. And if you can increase sort of one of those indicators or one of those actions, you may also be able to increase, you know, sort of the awareness or the empowerment of your vote counting.
Sarita?
Yeah, I think this is where it's really important to remind folks that local, again, I said it earlier, local elections have the biggest impact on your day-to-day life. And those truly can come down to a handful of votes, 5 votes, 7 votes, 12 votes. And so while you might not feel like you can have a big impact when it comes to maybe the president or the senator within your area, you can have a big impact on who's on your school board. You can have a big impact on who is one of your judicial judges that's deciding if folks serve jail time or if folks get to go to a deferment program that can get them into some resources, right? So you can still use your vote to have a really big impact on your day-to-day, on your community. Again, this thought of neighborliness. If you are hoping to see your neighbors treated in a certain way, then those local races is where that really happens and where that change happens. And as our local politics change, it's more of a trickle up effect. We start to see that, maybe there isn't such a stronghold anymore because now we have a pretty diverse city council. Maybe there isn't such a stronghold anymore because now our judges in our county are actually, there's a 50-50 split sometimes. And so I think that allows folks to feel much more actively involved and that their vote truly does count for a lot more than just one little tick mark on one side or the other. And then the other piece that I always want to remind folks of is that while voting is an essential right as citizens of this country, not everyone gets the right to vote. And we have systems that have taken folks out of that. So whether it's because of voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression, whatever the case may be. And so really understanding the weight and the magnitude of what it means to be able to cast your ballot and reminding folks of the fact, and this isn't to make you feel guilty of like, oh, well, they can't do it, so I have to. But, it is to say that we can't take it for granted. You can, 1 year just be like, oh, I'm not going to vote. And then something could happen and you can't vote in the next one. And so now what do you have to show for it, right? So really wanting to hone in on the idea that your vote does make such a big difference.
Rafa.
Yeah, I would agree that your vote does make a big difference. And I also would agree with Sarita on the sense that it has more of an impact on the local level than perhaps on the state level or even on the national level. It all boils down back to issues, right? And it's not only what you do on election day, but it's also the civic engagement that you have, throughout the year. Where our Constitution does provide for a federal representative republic. It doesn't happen without the participation of people. Government just does not function well without our participation.
So we have a question from the audience from Craig Moore. Craig writes, one way to combat political polarization is for groups and individuals to come together when there is common ground. For example, we all want clean air, clean water, and safe communities, but nowadays people can't even agree on these issues, or they don't want to be seen as giving credibility to the other side. We hear more about political fights and not enough about consensus and working together. Even wearing masks in public during the pandemic has now become politicized. How do we effectively combat this growing trend of tribalism, particularly at the state and national level? Anyone? I see Patrick, you nodding. Do you want to try to take a stab at it?
Or Rafa?
Yeah. All right.
It's a really great question.
It is a great question. And I will say that, part of the problem is that, we is determining what are issues, mutual issues of concern, right? And that we all may have a different priority level of what those issues are. And not only that, we may agree on what an issue is a problem, but we may not agree on the approach on how to handle that issue, right? And that, those differences are part of human nature, right? Because we are obviously all humans, we don't think alike. And that's actually a good thing, because that's how we can better ourselves, by having a civil discussion on the issues themselves and playing back and forth the pros and cons of all the different issues, and then coming up with some sort of consensus. Where the polarization comes in is through political partisanship and all those type of things. Let me give you an example, and something that I've recently personally worked on. I've just formed a partnership with LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, Hispanic group. It's the grandfather of all the Hispanic groups in the United States. It started in the late 1920s, and not one of our traditional partners for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but they liked what we were doing on criminal justice reform. And I saw an opportunity to talk to them and say, hey, listen, I know that we don't agree on a lot of the issues, but how about foster care reform, right? Taking it to a different issue. And, and I pointed out to them that there are over 40,000 Hispanic kids in the foster care system, and our foster care system is in dire need of reform. Would you be willing to work with us on that issue? And they agreed, and this is the leadership of LULAC in Houston. Some very iconic folks that have been leaders of the civil rights movement for Hispanics in the state of Texas. And they saw, hey, you know what? Yeah, let's do that. So it's finding those, as Patrick, as you were saying, is, we may not agree on everything, but on the areas where we can come together, we should.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I mean, I can't say it better. I think one of the things I came across in some of my earlier research is what the stakeholders were calling the 80-20 rule. We may disagree on 80% of the issues, but if we can identify that 20% that we agree upon, let's work on it. And by working on that, starting small, prioritizing relationships and building trust, it can lead to much bigger, bigger consensus, bigger collaboration, bigger outcomes.
Sarita, did you want to add to that?
Sure. It's a little tricky because I work for the party, so clearly I am on one side. But that being said, that doesn't mean that we don't have bipartisan support and bipartisan issues that everyone can get behind. I think it was maybe Rafa who said, we might agree on something being an issue and disagree on how to deal with it. But that's sort of a good problem because that allows us to have collaboration and to get creative in our problem solving. Because now we are having to think about, well, how do we integrate this part that I like and that part that you like, and make sure that it's still functioning, the solution that we're coming up with. So while it can be challenging, I think it does create a space for really great creativity and innovation, which I think a lot of our problems right now are needing some creative innovating, and folks coming together and having some mutual understanding. So it's definitely possible. It might take a little bit. I think someone said it's going to take some trust. It's going to take some relationship building, again, coming back to neighborliness. And I think that's where we have to start before we can dive into, okay, so how do we fix this? It's just, how can we share space together and know that we can feel heard and respected, and then we can start solving problems.
Thank you, Sarita. So Rafa mentioned youth earlier. And so I do want to touch on that population. So in the past, research has shown that our millennial age voters continually have like the lowest turnout of any age bracket. Do you have any strategies that we can employ to foster stronger civic engagement among younger Texans, even before they become a voting age?
Yeah, I'd like to handle that or take a first stab at it. And, I think it goes back to our education system, and I think that what we need to do is that we need to focus more on actually providing that civic education at, during, K through 12, in various levels. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, that was a very important part of the curriculum. That seems to me that's kind of diminished over the years. One of the things that we've been doing as part of the Texas Public Policy Foundation is trying to help foster that civic education again, a refocus on history, because history is very important. It tells us where we came from and where we're going and what's left to do. And that if you're not well grounded on those things, it's difficult to feel that you're part of society and that your vote matters or your voice matters. And one of the things that we've done is that we've worked with Texas schools, public schools, private schools, charter schools, and try to provide some more of that civic education. One of the things that we've done is that we've published a little pocket constitution, and making sure that the Constitution gets reintroduced into the classroom. And this little booklet here has not only the US Constitution, but it has the US Declaration of Independence, the Texas Declaration of Independence, the Travis Letter, some of the important documents from history, Texas history, and to have those conversations on why they were important back then and why are they still important today. And if you don't have that as part of your education curriculum, and then it's clear that there's not going to be an importance of participating in the system.
Do either Sarita or Patrick want to weigh in on this need to get the younger voters involved, or do you think 2020 has changed that?
Yeah, I'll be really curious to see the data, because maybe it is changing. I was just looking at the data from 2018 that we have in our civic health report, and it really is. It tracks exactly the trends that are always reported. From the 18 to 24-year-old category, we had a self-reported voting in the last local election at 23%, 65 and older, 78%. So nearly 60 percentage point difference between those two age categories. But I think so also to answer this in a slightly different way, we also see major disparities in voting by income bracket and by education. And so I think, one of the emphasis that we should all do and emphasize in kind of civic engagement is think about those gaps and where those disparities exist between different social groups. And age is a really important one, but there are others out there that we should really be thinking about and addressing, because ultimately, right, it is how do we make everyone understand that their vote is important and their vote counts, and expressing this right to vote is part of their civic duty. I think that emphasizing that message is really important.
Sarita, do you want to weigh in on the youth vote?
Sure, I'll just add on a little bit. To Patrick's point, we have to think about the intersectionality that folks are living at. Youth, I think, can compound some of the others of what is that wealth gap, what is that education gap, and then adding in the fact that you maybe just don't have as much experience as the other people around you. But what I think is really important is that we start engaging young folks in the process earlier on. It's a requirement in Texas that high schools hold 2 voter registration drives, and that doesn't always happen across the board. So again, thinking about how can I get involved in my community, check to see if your local high school is doing their voter registration drives. And if not, and you're able to, see if that's something that you can get involved, get to the PTA, get to whoever is able to make that happen. And then also thinking about specifically with elections, younger folks, high school age kids can be poll watchers. They can be election day workers. You can help stand in line for someone. Like, there are different ways to have young folks involved in the process that is beyond just voting, right? Because if you can't vote yet, you might feel like, what can I do? What do I have a say about? But when we start getting young people involved at an earlier age and helping them understanding these big systems, then by the time they're able to vote, it's like, oh, well, sure, of course I have to vote. Like, I know I'm really lucky. I grew up with some very radical women in my life who from a very early age were like, voting is important. We're going to talk about voting in this house. We're going to talk about what your vote means in this house. But that's not true for everyone. But if we can start creating spaces and meeting folks where they're at, and engaging them where they're at, then we can hopefully continue to see those trends going up.
I have a couple of follow-ups from people in the audience. First of all, Rafa, could you let us know where people could get the pocket constitution that you have?
Sure. You can contact me at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I will make sure that I provide that contact information. And we have, we have a number of physical copies. Obviously, one of the challenges that we've had with the pandemic is, with the startup of schools being delayed and being involved, we shifted a little bit of going from physical copies of the Pocket Constitution to a digital format. So that's something that we're also working on at the foundation. So I'll be more than happy to provide that.
So contact the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Before we go to our call to action, I want to get in this other little question that we got from one of our viewers, and that is from Carmeletta Williams. She said, do you think the protests and the engagement with the younger population in that way will yield more younger voters coming to the polls during the election? Sarita or Patrick, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I feel like Zoom, it's a little bit of like, I just want to make sure they're not frozen and I'm not stepping over them. Yeah, when we think about who has predominantly been out in the streets protesting, that is definitely younger folks. We've seen folks, all across the board, but definitely a big surge of young people. We're seeing young folks get involved in politics more and more when we think about the students out of Florida fighting for gun reform, when we think about other groups of students who are calling for change in some really big ways, climate change, all types of things. So I think, out of some of maybe what we in the past might have called teen angst is really coming a deep desire to see change and to hold, again, this idea of holding the folks in charge accountable. So for young folks, that might be the adults in their lives if they're not able to vote yet. And even if this is their first election, it's making sure that they have an opportunity to vote for someone that they feel really represents them, or at the very least pushes the needle in the direction that they are wanting to see their community go in. So I think that definitely has been a way to get folks engaged. Like I said, at a lot of protests, especially here in Austin, we had folks doing voter registration, which means we were engaging folks who have never voted before. So that's young folks, that's maybe older folks in our lives who just didn't think that they needed to get involved in voting. So I think that definitely is helping. And I talk about this a lot with the pandemic and the current civic unrest and kind of call for racial justice. We are in a unique position where, because we are all in our homes, because we are all sort of, in front of a screen or around news in a way that we aren't usually, we have really had to watch what's happening. And we have really had to, whether we, for better or for worse, whether we want to or not, really see what is going on within our government, within our communities. And again, regardless of what side you fall on, I think that is a big motivator for folks, especially for young folks, of I want to be a part of the change. I want to be a part of the solution to the problem that I've identified.
Thank you so much. We only have about 5 minutes left. We do want to get to our call to action because it's such an important part of the Engage series. We know voting is an important part of civic engagement, and we have been posting some key 2020 election dates in our chat. If you're watching on Facebook, we've also been posting links to 5 county voting websites in our region, so you can find specific information about voting in those details. And as we wrap up the discussion, if each of you could give us a call to action, and here it is. What are ways each of us can improve the civic health of our communities and stay involved? Rafa, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, thank you, Judy. And again, it's been a pleasure to participate in this panel with all of you. I would say election day is important, but what is as important, or perhaps even more important, is what happens in the other 364 days. And that, yes, your vote is important and it does matter, but your voice is also much needed in the day-to-day governing of your city or town, of the state, even on the federal level. And you need to be involved, on your school board, in your city councils, in your state legislatures, and even in Congress. Again, we have a representative republic. Yes, we do vote for them, but they need to hear from us. Again, this form of government does not function well without citizen participation, and we need to participate on every level, at every juncture, and on every day.
Patrick.
Yeah, so some of my favorite research suggests that the biggest indicator or the biggest predictor of volunteering is volunteering with your parents when you were a kid. And so I think whether you're a parent, you're a grandparent, or you're just a good neighbor, is to do this with others, right? Engage in these civic activities, whether it's voting, whether it's volunteering, whether it's the neighborhood block party, to the degree that we can do that with our relations, that will ultimately advance and increase the civic health here and beyond.
And finally, Sarita, your call to action.
Yeah, I of course want everyone to go out and vote, and please use the resources available to figure out your voting plan. And then it's going to be a little specific. Look up who your city council member is. That is sort of your first point of contact with your local government. Look up who they are, look up where they stand on things. Beyond voting, you have a right to reach out to them, to write them, to call them, to go to city council meetings and submit public comment. But just starting to understand what happens at that local level.
Thank you all.
Thank you. So I just want to thank all of our panelists for all the work that you're doing in our community. This has been a very informative conversation. We did have some more questions coming in, so I'll try to get those to you all to see if you can answer them in our follow-up email. We will have part 2 of this discussion on November 12th at 10 a.m. and the topic will be Election 2020 outcomes, surprises, and moving forward. And we're really going to emphasize the moving forward. And we hope to see all of you there. So thank you again.
And I want to also say thank you to everybody watching on Facebook today. We appreciate you caring enough about this topic to give us an hour of your time. Again, thanks to our wonderful panel, and everybody go out and make it a great day.